One of the things that has always irritated me about the claims that religious people make is when they think that really, really believing something is the same thing as knowing it. As if the power of positive thought could change reality if you could just believe hard enough. So they have to convince themselves and assert their conviction with certainty. Like when this country music singer said on Fox News,
I know there's a God.
Right.
I know for a fact
And
there's
Ellen,
a God.
but it's not a fact. A fact is a point of objectively verifiable data, and you can't demonstrate that. So you don't really know it either, because knowledge is testable and demonstrable. You can show what you know. But if you can't confirm the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you cannot actually know what you merely believe. So when one of our local Dallas megachurch pastors said,
I know there is a God.
I just had to say something to correct him.
So that's point number 2. Here's point number 3. There is a God. There is a God.
Oh, I see. You know there's a God because there's a God, and you know that because you know there's a God. Well, that is logically fallacious. I mean, your first point was your misunderstanding of science, and your second point was misrepresenting the atheist position. Now your third point is simply assuming your own original premise? That's called question begging, a logical fallacy wherein your argument is invalid because of one or more flaws in reasoning, which you have consistently demonstrated throughout your entire sermon.
Now you have to remember that I'm telling you how I know there's a God, okay? So this is how I know.
If I show you what I know, the result is that you'll know it too. But if you show me what you know, it'll turn out that you didn't really know it either. This is the 3rd episode we've done on this topic, and so far you haven't given any reason yet to believe in a God, much less any justification for your claim to know that there is one. I mean, you said that...
I'm going to use science.
And that...
In order for you to say that something exists, you have to have done a study, you have to have the facts to back it up.
So what are the facts and evidence that justify your claim? How do you know what no one even can know, and therefore can only believe on faith?
Now, you might take what I just said, you might take the argument that I just used, and hopefully it wasn't argumentative, but you might take the argument that I just used and say, well, okay, Pastor, I'm going to turn it around on you. You told me that I couldn't say there is no God because I don't have all knowledge. So I'd like to say to you, how can you say there is a God and you don't have all knowledge either? And you're right, I don't even have less than 1%. I'm like at 0.0000000000001. Okay, I understand that. Okay, but it's a great question. It is a great question. Again, let me repeat the question. You might say, Pastor, you told me that I couldn't say there is no God because I don't have all knowledge. How can you say there is a God? Okay, so let me take my illustration of a place, which is Paris, Texas, and use another noun, a person, okay? So a person, let me just use a person, okay? What if I said this? There is a person named Thomas Miller.
Well, that's hardly an extraordinary claim. I mean, a quick search on Facebook returned more Thomas Millers than I care to count. However, I found only one Facebook for God. It's a public figure page, not his own personal timeline, and someone else was running it, which is how it always is with God. We're supposed to believe that God is all-powerful, yet he always needs people to do his work for him. He can allegedly create planets and dinosaurs and anything humans can't make, but he can't make anything humans can make. He can't make a box, or a boat, or a building. He can't even write his own book. Isn't it funny that a ghost needs a ghost writer? Someone else far less competent or capable always has to do all of God's work for him, as if he can't really do anything himself, as if he was never really there.
Okay, now Pastor Thomas is seated right here on the front row. Say hi to everybody there. There's Pastor Thomas. You can see Pastor Thomas and Debbie came to hear me today, so it's very sweet of them in a 4,000-seat sanctuary. It's kind of like when I started preaching at the Highway 80 Rescue Mission.
Positive claims require positive evidence. You said there was a Thomas Miller, and you presented the evidence to back that claim. There's Thomas Miller. Very good. Now, can you do that with your God? There's Jesus right there in the front row. Say hi to everybody. You can all see that Rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef came in to see us today, or so that we could see him. I mean, I hear that nothing is impossible for your God, that he can break all the laws of physics at once just because you asked him to in a prayer. If you really believe that he can do absolutely anything, then have him say hi, like Pastor Thomas did. Why can't your God do what any normal person who really exists can do?
Anyway, all right. But here's the point. What if you said to me, there is no person named Thomas Miller?
We were supposed to be talking about your God of creation and your assertion that all the experts in anything are wrong about everything and that you know better than all of them, even though you know nothing by your own admission. And you're putting that highly controversial and extraordinary claim in the same category as the trivial coincidence that someone with a common first name also has a common surname?
What if you told me that?
Fine. If I said something that stupid, then I would have made a negative claim that I can't prove. But because it's also an absolute statement, you could disprove it with but one exception, provided you actually have the evidence that we're still waiting for.
I would say to you, well, have you met every person in the world? Doesn't that make sense?
No, science does not assert that this or that does not exist. Instead, we adhere to the null hypothesis, meaning that unsupported assertions are not considered valid. We're not going to believe you just because you say so. You need evidence to show whether something is possible, much less probable. For example, if a faith healer says that he can expel demons or cure some disease just by kicking you in the crotch, provided you give him a $1,000 vow of faith first, or if someone with the mind of a child says that obstetricians don't know what they're talking about because they're all part of the conspiracy that wants to teach sexual reproduction in school against God's will, all while suppressing stork theory, then you'll have a good idea what it's like when creationists try to argue against evolution. Or perhaps if someone who draws cartoons for a living says that the well-supported theory of plate tectonics is bunk and that the Earth is actually growing inexplicably, or maybe that it's flat and that the whole universe orbits around us, we would not give any of these ideas credence until they earned it. We don't have to disprove something that hasn't even been substantiated, especially when there is already evidence against it. The truth is what the facts are. If you can't show me the truth of it, then you can't honestly say whether there is any truth to it. If there is no evidence of Thomas Miller, then that's what we'd say, that his existence is an empty assertion, unsupported by anything. Come back when you have something to show. Until then, we have nothing to talk about because it is nothing until you show me something. But you have not earned the benefit of the doubt if you can't provide sufficient reason to believe that there is even a possibility to consider. Your inability to use logic or to understand science, philosophy, the atheist position, or even your own scripture does not count as evidence for yours or any God.
How can you tell me there is no Thomas Miller unless you've met every person in the world? You can't. But I can tell you that there is a Thomas Miller because I've met him, I talk with him, and he's my friend.
No, those are just additional assertions of subjective impressions. You can say that there is a Thomas Miller because you have demonstrable evidence to validate that claim. There's Thomas Miller sitting in the front row. Now, where is Jesus? Is there any fact that indicates you're Jesus or his alleged father, the God of Abraham, who is still worshipped by the Jews and Muslims? They're the ones who still keep that very first commandment that you Christians are breaking. Is there evidence of this God or of any God from any religion or anything supernatural at all? Can you produce any fact indicating that these gods and ghosts you believe in currently exist anywhere outside of human imagination?
Now listen to me carefully. And I can tell you that there is a God because I've met him.
No, you haven't.
I talk with him.
No, you don't.
And he's my friend.
No, he isn't.
See, I don't have to have met everyone in the world to tell you Thomas Miller exists. I just have to have met Thomas Miller.
Having a magic imaginary friend is not like having a real friend. When you talk to Pastor Thomas, he can disagree with you, and he can teach you things you didn't already know. Your God can't do either of these things, because when you talk to God, you're only talking to yourself. When other people talk to your God, they get different answers that contradict the answers that you get. None of you can ever learn any new information that you could not have already known, because your God doesn't know any more than you do. Nor can your God have corrected any of the many errors you've already committed in this sermon before you shared it to 30,000 some odd people, because your God should know everything I do too. But the reason that your God is just as stupid as you are is because he is who you are. And he is no more than you are. In fact, he is less than you are, because his existence depends entirely on you and your belief in him. You might get wise one day and he'll just go away, vanishing in a puff of logic. And if that ever happens, you will become more tolerant and more curious. That's a statistical trend that we've noticed that usually happens with pastors when they give up their faith.
It would be foolish for you to say Thomas Miller doesn't exist as a person unless you've met every person in the world.
But when you're talking about God, you're not talking about a normal person. We're talking about an extraordinary person, meaning that your evidence must be that much more profound. Finding a Facebook account is good enough evidence for regular people like Thomas Miller, but you'll need a whole lot more than that for a highly dubious and contested claim like you're God. So would it be foolish of you to say that Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill don't exist? Is it foolish for you to say that Vishnu doesn't exist? 800 million Hindus say that he does. That's more than every Protestant Christian denomination combined with Mormons, JWs, and everyone except the Catholics. Would it be foolish of you to say that Santa Claus doesn't exist? After all, he has more in common with Jesus than you'll likely admit. Have you ever been to the North Pole? Because you said that if you haven't been everywhere and you haven't looked everywhere and you don't know absolutely everything, then you can't even definitively say that Godzilla doesn't exist. Have you searched the entirety of the Marianas Trench? And if you had, maybe he wasn't home at that moment and you missed him. Even though Godzilla is obviously fictional and his existence would defy the laws of physics just like your God, you think your inability to find or disprove Godzilla proves that it's possible that he could exist. That's according to your logic. That's why the world doesn't use your logic. That's why positive claims require positive evidence, and unsubstantiated assertions of impossible nonsense like gods and monsters do not warrant serious consideration.
But it's not foolish for me to tell you Thomas Miller does exist because I have met him and I've talked with him and he's my friend.
The Nobel Prize-winning mathematician John Forbes Nash met his college roommate Charles Herman when he started at university, and he spoke with his friend frequently for many years afterward, even though no one else could ever see Charles Herman. Nor could anyone see many of Nash's other friends that he alone met and talked with. Even when other people interceded to say, "Who are you talking to, John?" There's no one there. So, having heard your evidence of God, I'm inclined to ask, is he in the room with us right now? And do you have any other friends that only you can see or hear? There was a moving scene in the movie about John Nash wherein his wife had to explain to him that all these people he knew and had been talking to for years didn't really exist. He rejected this, of course, because he could not consider the truth, just like you can't either. A few years ago, the National Alliance on Mental Illness defined delusion as a persistent false belief that is maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, to falsely claim something even when there is evidence otherwise. And what makes these beliefs delusional is that they don't change when the person is presented with conflicting information. The beliefs remain fixed even when the facts contradict them. By this definition, your religion definitely qualifies as a delusion. And for that reason, NAMI later changed their definition, saying that it's not a delusion if it is shared by the surrounding community. Literally the special pleading fallacy that it's okay when religion does it. But that still shows that the old adage is correct, that when one person has a delusion, it's called insanity. But when many people have a delusion, it's called religion. It starts when you encourage prayer, actively talking to your imaginary friend. It doesn't have to be a god either. It could be your spirit totem or the ghosts of your dead ancestors or aliens from outer space communicating telepathically. It could even be your soccer ball, Wilson. The point is, if you talk to any imaginary character long enough, eventually they'll start talking back.
In the same way, this is what the studies show us today. Over 1 billion people in the world today, over 1 billion, say that they have met God, that they've talked with him and he's their friend.
I was not able to find any such study. I don't believe there is one, not an actual study, not that says all the things you just said yours did. This again demonstrates how you have the burden of proof to produce whatever poll or study you're talking about. My negative response to your positive and unsupported assertion does not require any negative evidence. I don't have a burden to prove that your cited study does not exist. We take for granted that it doesn't until you show otherwise. If you do produce such a study that says all the things you said this one did, then that won't make me a liar. But if you don't produce the study when you should, because you can't, because there isn't one, that will make you a liar. The reason I'd like to see whatever nonsense propaganda you're really referring to is because I know something about religious statistics. And if there really were 1 billion people claiming that they met God and talked with him and he's their friend, then I would have to say that at least most of them are friends with a different God than yours. And just for one famous example, look at George Harrison of the Beatles. He believed in a personal God, and he said that if one chants the mantras with devotion, Lord Krishna would visibly appear and speak to him in an audible voice. He said that it's pointless to believe in something without proof, and Krishna consciousness and meditation are methods where you can actually obtain God perception. You can actually see God and hear him, play with him. It might sound crazy, but he's actually there, actually with you. So, Pastor Morris, should we believe George Harrison, that his God is actually with him? Is it enough that Harrison said that he knows Krishna exists because he met him, he talked with him, and they're friends? How is it possible that Lord Krishna talks to George Harrison and millions of other Hindus, and Jesus talks to you? One possibility, the only possibility, is that neither of you has ever actually met or talked with or befriended either of these imaginary beings. So why do both of you have these fictitious friends? For the same reason that millions of other people have met and talked with and befriended their gods. I know a professional medical technician who lives not 2 miles from me who worships the Egyptian cat-headed goddess Bast because she appeared to him visibly, she embraced him physically, and she spoke to him audibly, asking him to become her disciple, which of course he did, because how do you say no when a topless goddess shows up in your bedroom? So this guy and George Harrison both know their God exists for the same reasons that you don't really know your God exists either. It's all in your imagination. It is literally make-believe. It's not real. Faith is inherently auto-deceptive. It can cause you to see, hear, and feel any God from any pantheon. Whatever religious traditions you were raised with will most likely recur in adulthood. Faith can convince you that your spiritual form can project out of your body and that you can remember past life experiences and commune with spirit guides on a Ouija board. And faith can also convince you that you are receiving telepathic transmissions from extraterrestrial reptiles or thetans giving you secret information about the Illuminati. None of that has to be real at all for you to experience it all through faith, if you could just believe hard enough. A dear old friend of mine who became a Southern Baptist minister told me to fake it till you make it. Just keep telling yourself it's true until you believe it.
God exists.
That is a positive claim, and I'm still waiting to hear positive evidence. I'll accept anything that qualifies as evidence, any body of objectively verifiable facts that are positively indicative of and or exclusively concordant with your God hypothesis over any other available explanation. So, what evidence do you have to justify what you say you know? Now, if you'd only said you believe that God exists, then you're off the hook. But you stated that as a fact. So if it's not really a fact and you don't really know, then you're lying. Citing facts that are not facts, pretending to know things you don't know, are both lies. Yet, precisely those lies are what all religions are based on. But what if the truth mattered more than whatever you'd rather pretend? What if you didn't want to be fooled into believing anything that wasn't evidently true? Your first step in the pursuit of truth is to question and seriously challenge your faith.
Now, years ago, I met this guy who told me he was an atheist, and I said to him, can we talk about that and still be friends? And can I give you a different point of view? And he said, yes. He said, but I'd like to keep the conversation on an intelligent level, a scientific level. That was meat in front of my eyes. I said, oh, that's great. That's what I want to do too.
No, it isn't. That was never true for you. You saw him as a mark, an easy target, someone you could befuddle with your word game.
And I shared with him what I've shared with you. And we got down to the end, and I said to him, so you can't tell me there is no God, but I can tell you there is a God. And he said, I think you're right. So I guess I'm an agnostic, not an atheist.
So he asked you to keep it on an intelligent and scientific level. But instead of honoring that wish, you told him what you told us, wherein you never provided any of the scientific evidence you promised and that we're still waiting for. Instead, you contradicted science using fallacious logic to misrepresent what atheism is. Now, I admit there are a handful of self-identified philosophers who do not represent mainstream atheism who like the assertion definition that you use, for reasons that I find to be indefensible, inapplicable, and inaccurate. To me, it's only good for starting pointless arguments, and I think that's why those philosophers, and only philosophers, like that definition. But the original and still consistent, current, common, working definition throughout the atheism movement is and always was a lack of belief. Because atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theists define themselves as believers. Thus, it follows that atheists are unbelievers. We are without belief in God, just as agnostics are without knowledge of God. Anyone who is not convinced that an actual deity really exists is atheist. Beyond that, they might be agnostic or anti-theist, doesn't matter for this discussion. So you misled that poor sap right from the start. What happened next?
And I said, okay, so let me just ask you a question. If God does exist, would you like to meet him? And I remember watching, now I'm talking about like, not in the metaphysical, but in the spiritual world. I remember watching his heart turn, just like that. I've seen it a lot because I've led a lot of people to Jesus. And there's a point in the conversation where you can see their heart go, and I saw it. And I'm sitting there talking to him, and I said, if God exists, would you like to meet him? And he was silent for about a minute. His eyes filled up with tears. His lips started quivering. His heart went like that. And here's what he said to me. I'll never forget it. He said, I'd like to meet him right now. I'd like to meet him right now. And I shared with him the gospel, how God didn't want robots, so he gave us a free will that each of us could choose, and how he sent his son to die for us on the cross. And I led him to Christ.
No, you didn't. Sorry. I know you like that story. It makes you feel all squishy and your gutty works. But that's not what really happened. People can be rational, logical, and reasonable, but we can also be emotionally manipulated, leading to very addictive sensations. Supposed supernatural spiritualism appeals to the very same area of the brain as illicit narcotics, which is why those people who are especially fond of drugs also tend to be especially susceptible to religion. That's why so many converted Christians were formerly drug-addicted alcoholics. They're simply trading one addiction for another, with similar effects, but more socially acceptable. Had I been that guy that you're talking about, then as soon as you started in with the Gospels, I would have called you out for having broken your promise. I wanted to meet God right now, and instead of that, you got out your meaningless and self-contradicting storybook. Show me your God. I mean, Christians can't even have free will, logically, for a few reasons. Not if God already knows everything you're going to do before you do it. If everything is preordained and you can't surprise him and ruin his prophecy, then you don't have free will. Especially not if you've got the threat of the hell like a gun to your head, because extortion doesn't allow for a free choice either. And there's a whole lot wrong with God sending his supposed son to be a scapegoat as just one of several conditions for his unconditional love, a sacrifice that never needed to be made because he could have just forgiven us for something that wasn't wrong anyway and that never actually happened in the first place. But those are all topics for a different conversation. So you did not lead anyone to Christ. You only dragged them into your delusion.
When I'd go back and visit and see him 2 or 3 years later, he had won countless people to Christ. And he'd always tell them, I used to be an atheist until I found out you can't be an atheist scientifically.
So he believed a lie this whole time. I want to talk to this guy. Somebody put me in touch with him, because that's a pet peeve of mine. I was an atheist and didn't know it for like 15 years before I finally found out what that word really meant, because I believed the same lie that you're still telling now, trying to diminish atheism into an unreasonable position, as if we're the ones making indefensible claims, as if we're the ones claiming to know what no one even can know. We've seen how well that works for you, haven't we? You wouldn't bother with an anti-theist. They typically know the science, history, philosophy, and even your own scripture better than you do. and you don't want to know how things really are. So you'd leave the anti-theists alone. Instead, you'd target the average unbeliever. If atheism were just a denial of God proposition, a position which I think requires extensive education, then you would put the burden of proof on them. I can manage that, but your average unbeliever can't. Then, if your unwary target thinks that the only other option is agnosticism, and you misrepresent that too so that he thinks it means that he has to say that he doesn't know, this achieves the illusion of false equivalence, giving a susceptible target the impression that their perfectly reasonable position has somehow been weakened, as if your delusion ever had any comparable validity at all, as if superstition and reason were two sides of the same coin, which they are not. We're literally comparing fact versus fantasy. You cannot admit or allow your quarry to know that atheism simply means that we don't believe you, because that means that you have to come up with a reason why we should. And believers hate the burden of proof like a vampire hates garlic, because you don't have a good reason, which is why you rely on fallacious arguments in lieu of evidence.
And he was leading people to Christ one after the other. His whole life changed.
That's what happens when you take up drugs or religious delusion, both being similarly addictive. That's the reason that former smokers are the most outspoken anti-smokers. That's the reason that former believers are the most outspoken anti-theists. You're telling me that you got your friend high and that he's an addict now, spreading the addiction. If you had heard drug users bragging the same way you have, I'm sure you would have the same reaction to them that I'm having to you. It's not a harmless fantasy either. Religion is a means of manipulation of the masses to extort, support, and secure social, financial, and political power. But why am I telling you that? You've got $50 million in a 4,000-seat stadium sanctuary, so you already know that you are the dopamine dealer for 30,000 congregants and that they will pay a high price for that fix. Drugs and religion are both life-changing, but the same thing happens when you take up education or activism or dedicate yourself to any other passion. The day I finally realized that atheism didn't really mean what you and certain philosophers always told me it meant, the day I realized that label actually applied to me, that was life-changing, because it meant that I'd been lied to all my life and that I should do something to save others from the indignity of being duped by the deliberately misleading misinformation that your ministry is spreading now.
Because he realized there is the possibility of a God, and if there's the possibility, would you like to know him?
Possibility does not mean probability, and even if there was a probability, that wouldn't qualify as knowledge. The reality is there is no possibility, because you have not shown any precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon to indicate that any such possibility even exists. Nor can you. And you already know why you can't.
It is